So our next speaker is going to be Bryan Rader, president of MDU at Pavlov Media. Bryan has been very helpful during the preparation of this summit, and everybody seems to agree that he's like the been around the industry for such a long time that he's almost considered the godfather of MDU. So, Bryan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I now feel like the old man in the room, which maybe I am. I used to go to these sessions many years ago, and I was the youngest guy in the room. Now I'm on the other side, but I do appreciate the opportunity. I'm the president of MDU for Pavlov Media, and today's topic is around managed Wi-Fi and how we got here and why it matters. As we look back over the last 40 years in our business, I think it's really helpful to get the perspective over time as we lead up to bulk managed Wi-Fi. So I'm going to take us back through several generations. The 1980s, which, by the way, was the best era for music. I don't know if the rest of the panel agrees, but I'll start there. Clearly the best era for music. But in the 1980s, when the concept of multifamily tech really started to take hold, tech at the time meant analog, 450 megahertz, one-way coax, often strung across the ground and hanging outside of buildings to just capture cable TV channels. But that's where the industry was. And back at that time, the real estate owners were predominantly looking to get cable TV, and that's all they were looking for. That evolved into the 90s when it was all about access to analog programming, not just the 30 channels that were offered by the franchise cable companies, but a broadening of channel lineup and actually looking for ways to customize channels. This mattered to property owners. Back in the 90s, I know we live today in an era of 98% occupancy and 10% a year rental growth. But for many years in our industry, that wasn't the case. And back in the 90s, that clearly, for many periods of time in many markets, was not the case. Property owners were looking for ways to be different and special. And even something as simple as having 50 or 60 customized channels, even though they were analog, was a unique way for owners to be different. In the early 2000s, that evolved to digital programming and high-speed internet. I call it high-speed internet, but for any of you that were around at that time, high-speed internet was probably, I don't know, 20K, maybe. It was a very modest term to call high speed. But the real estate community was eager to get high-speed internet brought to their property, whether it came from coax or Ethernet. They were desirous of having something that was high speed. And so there was an arms race looking for alternatives to have providers bring high-speed internet to their community. Once again, the issue was, how can I be first in my submarket? How can I be different? How can I satisfy my residents? How can I give them a better experience living on my community? That evolved in the early 2000s to this concept of choice. And for many years, property owners didn't want one provider. They needed two providers. So they had a big cable company, a big phone company, or a big independent provider offering TV and internet services. And so that worked for a number of years. There were no longer exclusive agreements, but rather exclusive marketing agreements or non-exclusive agreements where owners could have two or three providers, duke it out, and the resident could pick and choose. But here was the problem with that. While owners like choice, and Kevin brought this up in his session, that some of the dissatisfied pointed to the fact that they didn't have choice any longer, choice also came with some liabilities. Number one, technicians would come to do an install and disconnect the wrong unit. Number two, you had people that were cutting other people's cable or cords. You had to wait for the guy to show up 4 or 5 days later. You had to pay an install fee. You had to pay a deposit. It was often confusing, and there was a lot of infrastructure that got into the way when you had multiple providers fighting over shared infrastructure in many cases. So that led to the next generation, which was the 2010s, when the business became really a rush to get better internet, better high speed, and it became a race for fiber. And really starting around the early 2010s, when Google Fiber launched in Kansas City, you started to see a desire for gigabit fiber or gigabit speeds over fiber. And so owners were craving ways to bring fiber to their community. And ultimately, that led to bulk internet. One of the challenges has been that when you move in and you have to wait 5 to 7 days and call an 800 number and set up an account and wait for someone to come and do an install, that really affected the onboarding process, and bulk internet solved for that. And today, as we'll go through 3 or 4 of these core themes, managed Wi-Fi became the ideal platform for bulk internet in the last several years. Those 5 themes, if you go back to the 1980s, were the key objectives of property owners throughout this past 40 years. Looking for resident experience, more convenience, obviously economic incentives. Can I charge for this? Can I charge more rent for this? Will I have greater occupancies or more stronger resident retention? Addressing common areas and office locations. This has often been the afterthought, but in reality, common areas and office locations are a key area of the community and a core objective of real estate owners. The distinction versus competition, whether it's a higher speed, a better price, quicker service, those are things that owners have always looked for over the last 40 years, and then ultimately creating value for the resident. There are 3 things, though, that have changed in this last era over the last 5 years, and I'll run through those rather quickly. The first one is, if you've toured a multifamily community recently, particularly a new construction community, you've seen an explosion in high-end amenities, not just pickleball courts or yoga studios or pet spas or fitness centers and cardio rooms. It's a never-ending process. The floor plans are getting smaller and the amenity spaces are getting larger. We used to talk in the 1990s about cocooning. Cocooning is what residents used to do. They would pull into the property at the end of a long day at work, get out of their car, run to their apartment, and they wouldn't leave until the next morning at 8 o'clock when they ran out and got back in their car and left the property. That doesn't happen today. Developers are building into the communities ways for residents to engage with others. They have areas around fitness centers and outdoor amenity spaces and pet walking areas. In fact, the pet population now exceeds parking spot numbers in many properties. So we've seen, see that the behavior of residents has changed a lot. They're outside their apartment homes, not inside their apartment homes. And all of these amenity locations have created a desire and a requirement for connectivity throughout the community, not just in the home. The second one is behavioral. As Kevin said in his presentation, millennials, 90% of millennials are still renters today. So we know the average age of a renter is younger than the overall average age of Americans today. They're early adopters. They were first to cut the cord. When rev share was the way that most property owners earned revenue in this business, and it was mostly focused on cable TV, about a decade ago, we saw that go from very high to very low, as apartment residents were the very first resident or demographic to cut the cord. They were early adopters to Netflix. They were first to gaming and streaming, and now remote learning, and ultimately working from home. All of this over the last decade has drove an explosion of usage and demand for better connectivity. And the last one is innovation. So with the advent of smart home and IoT features, property owners have looked for ways to create more of a single family environment in multifamily. They're also looking for a way to improve the management of the entire community, whether it's how they manage vacant units or access control, thermostat control, leak detection. A lot of new move-ins are bringing their own smart home features with them, and they want to connect those devices to a Wi-Fi network, and that's changed quite a bit. As owners have looked to make multifamily more like single family, it's putting greater pressure on a wireless network as well. So for all of these reasons, whether it's the ownership groups wanting convenience for their resident, the experience for the resident and greater value, the explosion in amenity areas expanding across multifamily dramatically in the last several years, the concept of residents' usage quadrupling, cutting the cord and moving from traditional TV to only streaming, and smart home features, expanding property management opportunities for greater efficiency and how owners are managing their communities, along with economic options. Look, over the last 40 years, we've always had a desire to look for ways for owners to create economics from prop tech or resident technologies. These themes have always been here, but all of these themes have pointed back to how we got to managed Wi-Fi. And today, bulk managed Wi-Fi has become the ideal solution for multifamily owners. It's the perfect solution infrastructure-wise to address all of these themes. from move in to move out. I don't have to call the guy. I don't have to pick a provider. I don't have to pay a deposit or an installation fee or stay at home from 1 to 5. I don't have to worry about whether someone left a cable modem hanging off of a drop wire in the apartment when they moved out. None of those things matter anymore. It is a seamless onboarding process when done correctly. The amount of usage by staff, the way maintenance staff move around the property, they can now manage the communities, manage their own community by doing work order closeouts with their iPad as they're walking into apartment homes and doing trouble tickets. Better resident experience, not only the connectivity at home, but throughout the entire amenity spaces on properties. And that's really exploded over the last decade. And finally, it's seamless